The summer of 1879 came hard and early to Colorado. Boone Hargrove was on the roof of the barn when his brother called him down. He had been up there since before full light, replacing three split shingles on the south face where last winter's ice had worked under the wood and done what ice always does in the end. He set each nail with two taps to seat it and one drive to finish, the way his father had shown him when he was 12 years old. The way his father had shown him everything worth knowing about how to build something that would hold. He heard his brother's voice rise from the yard below and climb down without being called twice. Lyle was standing at the kitchen table when Boone came through the door. Not sitting, standing, a letter on the table in front of him and his hands at his sides like a man who had just set something down and was not entirely sure he should have. Boone looked at the letter, then he looked at his brother. From when, he said, January, and you're telling me now. It was July. Lyle pulled out a chair and sat down, which was its own kind of answer. He was 30 years old and the second of three brothers, and the one most likely to think through every angle of a thing before saying a word about it. That patience was usually worth something. Right now it sat in the kitchen like a third man nobody had invited. How many times back and forth, Boone said. 6, she answered every one. Boone picked up the letter. The handwriting was small and careful. Each letter formed with the precision of someone who had learned penmanship from a strict teacher or from want of paper and could not afford to waste space on the page. The return address read, Nora Ellis, Dodge City, Kansas. He set the letter back down without reading it. You used my name, he said. The ranch needs a name attached. Yours made more sense. That was true. Boone was the eldest. The ranch was registered in his name along with his brother's, but his name stood first on every document and had since their father died. He understood why Lyle had done it. That did not make the moment feel any smaller. Reed came in from the barn smelling of horses and early sweat, looked at the two of them standing around a letter on the table and said, What happened? Lyle told him. All of it. The advertisement in the Kansas Prairie Gazette. The 6 months of letters. The woman in Dodge City who had written back every single time. He told it plain and without decoration because that was the only way Lyle ever told anything that mattered. Reed listened through all of it. When Lyle finished, Reed looked at the letter for a moment. Then he looked at Boone. Then he said one word. When, not why, not what were you thinking, just when, because Reed's mind went straight to the practical question first and left everything philosophical for someone else. Boone had always respected that about his youngest brother, even on the occasions when it made him want to shake him. She said she could be ready in 3 weeks if we agreed, Lyle said. Reed nodded. We need to fix the east wall in the corner room before she gets here. The plaster is coming loose above the window. Boone turned to look out the kitchen window at the yard at the split rail fence his father had built in 1861 at the line of mountains to the west, where the snow never fully left the highest peaks, even in the middle of summer. He thought about Eleanor. He always thought about Eleanor in moments like this one, even 4 years after she had gone, because Eleanor was the measuring stick he used when decisions involved a woman coming to this place. Eleanor had arrived in the spring of 1873 with genuine hope and a good coat and the honest belief that she wanted the life this land offered. She had lasted 2 winters before she told him that she could not continue, not because he had been unkind to her, not because the work was more than she could manage, but because the silence was too large and the nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, and she needed people the way some living things need water, in a quantity that this mountain country simply could not supply. He had closed the gate behind her wagon and stood in the road until the dust settled back onto the ground. Then he had gone inside and not spoken her name again. He was not angry at Eleanor. He had understood what had happened, but he had also decided something in that moment standing alone in the road, and that decision had not changed. A woman who came to this place needed to know beforehand clearly, and without the softening that hope tends to add to things exactly what she was choosing. Because the choosing was everything. The knowing was what made it possible to stay. If she comes, Boone said, still looking at the mountains, and she decides this life is not what she wants, after she has seen it, we take her back, not as a kindness, as an obligation. She came here on our word, and our word means something. The advertisement says we will take her home if she is not happy, Lyle said quietly. Then it is a promise, not a policy. There is a difference between those two things. Reed was already moving toward the hall. I will start on the plaster after lunch. That was how the Hargrove brothers said yes to most things, not with speeches, with the next task on the list. The ranch sat 12 miles north of Copper Ridge along a dirt road that turned red in dry weather and near impossible to navigate in wet. The house itself was built from lodgepole pine and mountain stone, with a roof pitched steep enough to shed the heavy snowfall that came every November without fail and stayed until March turned to April. 3 bedrooms, a wide kitchen with a window that faced east and caught the first light of every morning. A main room with a fireplace that Boone's father had mortared himself over a long autumn working by feel in the later hours when the light gave out. A front porch that faced south toward the valley below. A barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar, a well with water cold enough in August to make your hand ache after 30 seconds. It was not a beautiful property in the way that visitors from eastern cities meant when they used that word. It was something more durable than beautiful. It was a place built by men who intended to outlast the weather and had made every structural decision with that intention in mind. Not one board had been placed for the sake of appearance. Every beam and joint and foundation stone was there because it needed to be there. Elias Hargrove had bought the land in 1858 with a decade of wages saved from mining work in California. He had never struck it rich in the mountains and had not particularly expected to. What he expected was to save enough to buy good groundwork, it properly, and pass it to his sons. That was exactly what he had done until a rock slide in the winter of 1871 ended the passing before he had quite finished the conversation about it. Boone was 26 when they buried their father on the eastern edge of the property under 2 pines that stood close together as if by arrangement. Lyle was 22, Reed was 19. 3 brothers with a working ranch and a Colorado winter ahead of them, and not one of them ready to stop needing what they had just lost. Nobody said much in the 3 days after. On the 4th morning, Boone looked across the breakfast table at his brothers and said, "The ranch runs, we run it." That was the whole decision, and it had held for 8 years without needing to be revisited. The wagon arrived 3 days late. Nora Ellis had been expected on a Tuesday. By Thursday evening, the corner room had been plastered and painted, the mattress turned to its better side, and a new cotton curtain hung in the window by Boone during his last supply run into Copper Ridge. He had purchased it without comment from the dry goods shelf at Alderman's store and carried it home without mentioning it. Reed had spent a combined 4 hours across those 2 days on the front porch, looking south toward the road while pretending to do other things. Lyle had cooked enough food for 4 people at every meal since Tuesday and eaten his own portion at a pace suggesting he was in no hurry for the meal to be over. Nobody suggested going to meet her. Boone had said once that if she changed her mind about coming, that was her right and the point did not need to be made twice. On Friday afternoon, with the sun beginning its slow lean toward the western peaks and the light going amber across the valley floor below, a wagon appeared at the far end of the road. one wheel running slightly low, the whole rig listing a degree to the left. Jacob leaned at the reins, a reliable man who carried the particular expression of someone who had resolved a mechanical problem several days earlier and was quietly proud of having gotten through it. Boone came down from the barn roof where he had been finishing the south face shingles he had not finished on Monday. He did not hurry across the yard. He walked with the deliberate pace of a man approaching a situation he intends to assess before committing to any particular response. Reed came around from behind the smokehouse. Lyle appeared in the kitchen doorway and then stepped out onto the porch. Jacob hauled back on the reins and the horse stopped with the resigned dignity of an animal that has been on the road since before sunrise. "Brought your girl," Jacob said. "Wheel trouble at Ridgeway held us up 3 days. Sorry for it." Boone stepped forward and reached for the wagon door. His intent was practical. Someone had ridden 12 miles in July heat in a wagon with a compromised wheel and would need a hand stepping down onto uncertain ground. He put his hand up. The door opened. He saw her hand on the frame first. Small, the knuckles white from gripping wood. She had positioned her hand lower on the frame than most people would, not reaching for the top, but bracing against the midpoint the way a person does when they have learned to manage their own weight without assuming assistance will be present. Then she was in the doorway and he was reaching up and her eyes went to his hand and she flinched. It lasted less than a breath. The drawing back of one shoulder, the slight contraction of the whole body away from the approaching thing. Automatic. The kind of movement that bypasses the thinking mind entirely because it has been trained into the body by something older and more persistent than conscious thought. She caught herself, stopped, met his eyes. Her eyes were the color of the Colorado sky on a clear morning, that particular shade of blue that exists at altitude and nowhere else. They were not frightened eyes. They were measuring eyes, the eyes of someone who had learned that every new situation requires assessment before it permits trust. Boone held his hand exactly where it was. He did not advance it and did not withdraw it. He waited. She stepped down on her own, one hand on the frame, one foot finding the wheel spoke, then the ground. She stood in the yard and looked at all three of them in turn. She was small, 5'3" at the most, and that was a generous estimate standing in front of three men who cleared 6'5" apiece at a minimum. In the late afternoon light, she looked like something the mountain wind might move without effort. She did not stand like something the wind could move. Her back was straight, her chin was low. The expression on her face was not the hopeful nervousness of a young woman newly arrived at a strange place. It was something more deliberate than nervousness. She was in the process of deciding something, and she was taking the time she needed to decide it properly. "Hargrove," she said. "Yes," Boone said. "All three of you." "All three." She looked at Reed, at Lyle, back at Boone. There was a pause that had real thinking in it. "The letters were signed B. Hargrove," she said. Lyle looked at the wagon wheel. Reed looked at the barn. Boone said, "That's me." She accepted this information with the careful neutrality of someone filing it away for later consideration. Then she looked past all three of them toward the house and her eyes went immediately to the roof line. "Good pitch on that roof," she said. "High enough to shed heavy snow without sacrificing headroom in the loft." Nobody had expected that to be the first observation. Reed stepped around her and took the wooden trunk from the back of the wagon without being asked. It was small, the kind of trunk a person packs when they have thought seriously about what is worth bringing and have made real decisions about the difference between necessary and sentimental. "Thank you," she said, watching him lift it. 2 words, but they were not automatic words. She had looked at him first, then said them. There was a tension in it, the kind of thanks that means what it says. Jacob Lund touched his hat, turned the wagon around, and started back down the road toward town. The sound of wheels on the dry road faded into the mountain quiet, and Nora Ellis stood in the yard of the Hargrove Ranch with her leather journal tucked under one arm and looked at the house and the mountains rising behind it. Not wonder in that expression, not relief, something more considered than either of those things. She had arrived somewhere she had been aiming for, and she was still in the process of determining whether the aim had been true. Reed found them when he went to latch the wagon door that evening. He was not looking for anything. He was simply working through the small closing tasks of the end of a day, the kind of work that accumulates and gets done by whoever notices it before going inside. He reached for the interior latch, and his eye moved to the grab rail. The wooden ledge on the inside of the door where a passenger braces a hand on a long ride through rough country. 3 marks cut into the wood, each one about an inch long, spaced with the even precision of someone who was being deliberate about the spacing. Not scratches from ordinary wear, not the random marks that accumulate on working wood. These had been made with the tip of something sharp, one after another, with intention, like a man marking days on a wall, like someone keeping count of something. Reed stood in the fading light of the yard and looked at those 3 marks for a long time. He did not touch them. He latched the door and walked back to the house and sat down to supper and said nothing about what he had seen. But he carried it into sleep with him that night, and he was still carrying it the next morning when he woke. 3 marks. He did not yet understand what they meant. He would not forget them. The first supper at the table was 4 people, and the particular kind of silence that sits in a room where strangers are trying to determine the rules of a situation nobody planned in advance. Lyle had made a beef and potato stew because it was what he knew how to make well, and this was not an occasion for attempting something new. He had also made cornbread, which came out better than the stew. It usually did. Nora sat across from all 3 brothers and ate with the focused attention of a person who has not had a proper hot meal in 2 days of difficult travel. She did not perform modesty about her appetite, and she did not apologize for being hungry. Boone noted both of these things without intending to. Reed tried to fill the quiet. He usually did. He told her about the altitude in Colorado and how people from lower country often needed a week to adjust their breathing, and about the 2 horses in the barn that were difficult with strangers and the 4 that were not, and about the root cellar and the month's worth of supplies they kept down there every autumn against the possibility of being snowed in for 2 weeks at a stretch. He talked the way Reed always talked about things that mattered to him directly and without pausing to calculate how it was landing. She listened to all of it. When he finally stopped to eat something, she said, "Do you have fruit trees?" Reed blinked. "No. The east side of the property is protected from the northwest wind by the ridge. Good ground for apple trees. I noticed it coming up the road." Reed looked at Boone. Boone looked at his bowl. "We have talked about it," Lyle said. "More than talked," Reed said. "We just have not planted them yet." She nodded once and did not pursue the subject. She was not making a recommendation. She was making an observation about the land, and there was a specific difference between those 2 things. Boone was not sure many people would have recognized the difference in the way she said it. After supper, she asked if she could help clear the table. Boone said there was no need that first night. She accepted this without pressing the point and sat for a few more minutes with her hands folded on the table in front of her, not fidgeting, simply occupying the room without requiring anything from it. Then she said goodnight to all 3 of them and walked upstairs to the corner room that Reed had replastered and Boone had hung curtains in. For a woman who had crossed 3 states in the course of a week and survived 2 extra days of wagon trouble and arrived at a house full of strangers after all of it, she carried an extraordinary amount of stillness. Not the stillness of someone who had given up, the stillness of someone who had learned how to carry a great deal without letting it show on the outside. Boone was up past midnight. That was not unusual for him. He had slept in shorter intervals since his early 30s and used the quiet hours to walk the property or sit on the porch with a cup of water and listen to the particular sounds that the mountain dark made. The pines in the wind produced a sound that was not quite like leaves and not quite like breathing, something between the two that had no other comparison. The creek at the eastern edge of the property ran in a low, constant voice that you stopped hearing after the first month of living here and started hearing again years later when you tried to actually describe the place to someone who had never been to it. He went to the kitchen for water and came back through the hall. There was a line of light under the door of the corner room. Not the reading light of someone settled comfortably for the evening, a small and very still light. A lamp turned low. The shadow under the door did not move in any direction. He stood in the hallway for a moment. He did not knock. He went back to the kitchen instead and heated water in the small pot and added a pinch of mint from the bunch that grew wild behind the smokehouse, the same patch that Reed had been harvesting since he was old enough to find things in the dark. Then he came back through the hall and set the cup on the floor outside the door and returned to his own room. In the morning, the cup was gone, washed and returned to its place on the kitchen shelf, clean enough that it might never have been used. She had not left it for someone else to deal with. She had taken care of it herself. He did not mention the cup. She did not mention it. But something in the way she looked at him across the breakfast table in the early light told him she had noticed exactly what had happened and had decided not to make a moment out of it, which told him something about how she preferred to manage the things that came her way. On the second morning before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, and while the air still carried the night cold, Lyle went out to draw water for the coffee. She was at the well already. Her sleeves were pushed back above the elbows, and she was washing her hands in the bucket she had drawn up. The morning light was thin and blue, but it was sufficient. On her left forearm, just above the wrist, the skin held the coloring of a bruise that has passed through its worst stage and is traveling toward healed. Yellow at the outer edges, still purple at the center. The size of it was specific, and the location was specific in a way that Lyle understood without wanting to understand it. The shape of that kind of mark is made by a grip, not by contact with an edge or corner or any ordinary household accident. She looked up and found him looking. She did not flinch this time. She held his gaze for a moment with an expression that was not shame and was not challenge. It was closer to acknowledgement. A person who had been seen and knew they had been seen and was making a choice in real time about how to respond to that. She pulled her sleeve back down, smoothly. The practiced motion of someone who has performed exactly this movement many times before in exactly this kind of moment. Coffee, she said. Coffee, Lyle said. No. They went inside together and he built the fire under the pot, and she stood by the window with her back to the room and looked at the mountains turning from gray to gold in the early light. Neither of them said anything about her arm, but the morning had a different quality after that moment, the way all mornings do when something true has entered a room, regardless of whether anyone has yet found the words for it. Reed rode down to Copper Yidge on the third day for the weekly supply run. The list was routine nails, lamp oil, beeswax, cornmeal, salt, and a bar of soap from the general store. He tied his horse at the rail in front of Alderman's and worked through the list, methodically stopping to talk to two men he knew from the previous season's cattle work. Buying a newspaper, he would read that night and forget the next morning. On his way back to the hitching rail, he passed the boarding house on the corner of 2nd and Main. Fowler's boarding house, 8 rooms run by Margaret Fowler, who had been operating it since before Reed had started making this supply run on his own. She seemed to have been the same age for approximately 20 years, which Reed had always considered a remarkable achievement. She was sweeping her front porch when he came by. She looked up before he reached her. People in her line of work develop that habit after enough years of paying attention to what walked through their front door. "The Hargrove girl got in," she said. It was not phrased as a question. She did. 3 days late on account of wheel trouble. Mags Fowler rested the broom against the porch rail and looked at him with the specific attention of a woman who measures what she hears and what she sees separately before allowing them to combine into a conclusion. "She look all right," she said, and there was something in the way she asked it that made the question mean something more particular than the words on their surface suggested. Reed thought about it carefully. He thought about the way Nora moved through the house, always with her back close to a wall or a surface, the way her eyes swept a room before she moved through it. He thought about the stillness she carried and the way her hands, when they were not occupied, rested on the table with the deliberateness of someone who had trained themselves to keep still. "She looks tighter than she ought to," he said, "like a person who is used to things coming at her from directions she did not expect." Mags Fowler looked at him for a moment longer. Then she picked up her broom. "If you see anything that needs looking into," she said, "you come down and tell me." She went back to sweeping without elaboration, and Reed stood on the boardwalk for a moment past when he needed to stand there. Then he collected his horse and started back up the mountain road. The whole conversation rode with him the full 12 miles. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days after Nora did. It came with the ordinary mail tucked between a seed catalog and a hardware bill from a supplier in Denver. No return address on the envelope, nothing on the outside to identify the sender, only the name of the ranch and the road. Reed brought the mail in from town and set the stack on the kitchen tables he always did, and went to wash the road dust off his hands. Boone worked through the catalog and the bill and stopped at the plain envelope. His name was not on it. The ranch name was on it. He opened it. Inside was a single document, 3 pages folded in thirds. The first 2 pages were written in a careful, formal hand that belonged to someone who thought of writing as a professional instrument, each line measured and precise. The 3rd page was different. The letters were smaller, pressed deeper into the paper as if the hand that formed them had been exerting more force than the task required. The signature at the bottom of the 3rd page was a name he recognized. Ellis, Nora. He looked at that signature for a long time. It shook, not in a visible, obvious way, but the letters of her name had been formed by a hand that was not steady. The downstrokes broke slightly where they should have held. The crossing of the final letters drifted off the baseline by a fraction. A person writing in poor light might produce a signature like that. A person writing while afraid might also produce a signature like that. The 2 conditions were not mutually exclusive, and in this case, Boone had a strong and immediate sense of which one he was looking at. The document itself was a legal addendum to a marriage arrangement. Dense with technical language, but its meaning read twice was not ambiguous. It transferred administrative authority over the inherited property of one Nora Ellis to her legal guardian identified as Wade A. Ellis of Dodge City, Kansas, contingent on specified conditions regarding the status of any pending marriage contract. He read it a 3rd time. Then he set it on the table and called her name. She came from the direction of the stairs. She had the leather journal in her hand, the small one he had seen her carry since the morning she arrived. She came into the kitchen and looked at the document lying on the table, and something in her body settled the way a person settles when they see something they have been waiting to see finally materialize. Not surprise, recognition. He slid the document toward her. She picked it up and read it with the speed of someone who already understands the shape of what they are reading and only needs to confirm the details. She set it back on the table. She looked at the window, then she looked at him. "Do you know anything about the land south of town?" she said. He studied her face for a moment. Not what she had signed, not when, not under what conditions. "What do you know about the land south of town?" She was asking whether he was part of this, whether the ranch and the advertisement in the correspondence of 6 months had been arranged around something he already knew. She was not being accusatory. She was being careful, and careful was the only rational approach available to someone in her position. "I know nothing about it," he said. "Tell me." She pulled out a chair and sat across from him. She placed the leather journal on the table between them but did not open it. "My mother grew up here in Colorado," she said. "Her family had land along the river south of Copper Ridge. When she married my father, they moved to Kansas and she did not go back. But the land stayed in the family name. When she died in 1872, it passed to me." A pause, short and contained. "My father has always known about it. He has known about it my entire life. And he arranged for you to come here," Boone said. "He arranged the advertisement, the correspondence, the terms." She looked at the document between them. "I do not believe he sent me here because he wanted me to have a better life." She said the last sentence with the flat economy of someone who has been arriving at that conclusion for a long time and has fully arrived at it now and no longer needs to perform any grief about it. The grief, if there had been grief, had already been dealt with in private on her own terms. Boone looked at the signature on the third page, at the broken letters of her name. "Did you sign this willingly?" he said. The pause before she answered was longer than the question by itself required. She was not deciding what to say. She was deciding how much of the truth she was ready to say here in this kitchen to this man she had known for 8 days. "My father required me to sign a number of documents over the past several years," she said. "Some of them in conditions where I was not able to read the contents before signing." She reached across and touched the corner of the document without picking it up. "He described this one to me as a family authorization form. A formality," he said, "standard paperwork." She withdrew her hand. "It is not a family authorization form." Boone set both hands flat on the table. Outside the kitchen window, the mountains stood exactly as they always had, massive and indifferent, unchanged by anything occurring in the valleys below them. "Someone sent this to us with no return address," he said. "I know. That means someone wanted us to see it. Yes. Either as a warning or as a test." She said nothing to that, but something in her expression shifted in a way that told him he was not wrong about either possibility. He folded the document and laid it aside. "I need to think about this," he said, "and I will need you to tell me the rest of it when you are ready, not before you are ready, but eventually." She looked at him across the table for a moment that had real weight in it. Then she nodded, one nod clear and without any uncertainty in it. "Eventually," she said. That afternoon, she went out to the barn alone and stood before the horses the way Reed had shown her on the second morning. You approach from the front and to the side. You hold your hand below their chin level and wait for them to come to you. You let them make the first decision about whether to allow contact, because an animal that chooses trust is a different thing entirely from an animal that accepts handling because it has no choice. She stood in front of the big copper-colored mare and held her hand out at the right level and waited. The mare sniffed the length of her arm, moved her nose up toward the shoulder, breathed warm air against the side of her neck. Then the mare lowered her head and pressed her nose into Nora's open palm. Boone watched from the fence line. He had come out to check the water trough and stayed past when the checking was finished. She did not look toward him. Whether she knew he was there and chose to give no indication of it, or whether she was genuinely absorbed in the horse, he could not say. With her, the two things were sometimes difficult to tell apart. She stood in the barn with the mare for a long time in the warm late afternoon light. She did not speak to the horse or make sounds to it. She simply stood in contact with it and let the contact be what it was. When she finally walked back toward the house, she passed close enough to the fence that he could have spoken to her without raising his voice. He did not speak. She did not look over. But there was something in the way she carried herself, something fractionally different from how she had walked across the yard on the day she arrived, that Boone noticed without being able to name precisely. She was fractionally less braced, just fractionally, but it was there. That same evening in the rented room above a saloon in Dodge City, Kansas, Wade Ellis sat at a small table with a nearly empty bottle in front of him and a letter from Denver lying open beside it. He had read the letter 4 times since it came that morning. The signature at the bottom was Arthur Crane's, and the message was characteristically brief. The survey was complete. The valuation had changed significantly. New terms were required. A personal meeting could not be avoided. Come to Colorado. Wade Ellis was 52 years old, and he owed money to people in 3 different counties who were beginning to lose their patience with the pace of repayment. He had been sleeping in 4 and 5 hour stretches for longer than he could accurately track. He had sent his daughter to a ranch in the Colorado mountains because a businessman from Denver had paid him a sum of money to arrange it, and because the mathematics of his own life had narrowed to the point where the calculation of doing a wrong thing balanced better than the calculation of doing nothing and waiting. He was not a man who spent significant time thinking about what that said about him. He had found that kind of thinking was not especially useful. He folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He looked at the bottle and decided it was close enough to finished. He set it on the windowsill where the woman who cleaned the room would deal with it in the morning. He had a long ride ahead. In Denver, 150 miles south and east of Copper Ridge, Arthur Crane sat behind a desk that would have cost the average Colorado rancher nearly 6 months of income and studied a geological survey laid across its surface. The map was meticulous. Every measurement had been checked on the ground by his own man, a surveyor who had spent 30 years reading rock and had not been wrong about a meaningful formation in the last 15 of them. The notation at the bottom left corner of the map was written in red ink. It described in precise technical language the estimated volume and depth of a silver-bearing vein running beneath approximately 80 acres of riverfront property located south of a small mountain community called Copper Ridge, Colorado Territory. He had paid a considerable sum for the right to this information. He had paid Wade Ellis a smaller but still meaningful sum to manage the domestic arrangements that would put the relevant property into cooperative hands. The original plan had been sufficiently straightforward: a signed transfer of administrative authority, a period of patience while the legal documentation moved through the territorial courts, and then the orderly beginning of development. The problem with straightforward plans was their dependence on straightforward people. Wade Ellis was not straightforward. He was desperate, which was a different condition and produced different behaviors. Crane had managed desperate men before and was prepared for the complications that desperation introduced. What he was not fully prepared for was the geological reality now sitting in front of him in red ink. The revised estimate was 3 times the original, not twice. 3 times, a formation of this scale developed properly and without interruption could sustain extraction operations for 12 years or possibly longer. That single fact changed the entire structure of what he was doing here. A signature giving him the right to extract from the property was no longer what he needed. He needed the property itself. He picked up his pen and wrote a brief note to the hotel in Copper Ridge, where he had arranged accommodations. He would arrive by Thursday. He had business that could not reasonably be conducted by letter any further. He sealed the note and placed it in the outgoing tray on the corner of the desk. Then he turned back to the Mao and to the red notation and to the 80 acres of riverfront land that legally belonged to a 19-year-old woman who was at this moment living on a mountain ranch 12 miles north of the town built above all of it. He had never met her. He had never needed to meet her. But that calculation he was beginning to understand might not be entirely within his control. The corner room was quiet long after the rest of the house had gone dark. A small lamp burned at the desk by the east window, turned low enough to give working light without wasting oil. Nora Ellis sat at the desk with the leather journal open in front of her and wrote in the careful hand that she had developed over the years of keeping this particular record. Each sentence set down clearly as if it might need to stand on its own someday, without any context around it. She did not write about her father. She did not write about the storage room at the back of the house on the edge of Dodge City, where he had locked the door from the outside on the night when the debt collectors came and he needed her out of the way, or on the other nights when he simply needed someone to lock a door against. She did not write about the particular kind of time that passes in a room with no light when you are waiting for something to stop. She did not write the number 3, though she had been counting in threes for long enough that the number had taken on a shape she recognized the way most people recognize the shape of their own name. She wrote about the ranch. She wrote about the pitch of the roof and why it was correctly calculated for the snowfall levels at this altitude. She wrote about the copper-colored mare and the specific quality of the animal's attention when it made the decision to accept contact. She wrote about the smell of the kitchen at mealtimes, which was pine smoke and something dried and herbed that the middle brother used when he cooked. She wrote about the sound the creek made at the eastern property line, which she had heard on the second evening, walking out to look at the sky, and which was the kind of sound that kept existing whether or not anyone was listening to it. She wrote about the mountains at different hours, the blue-gray of them before sunrise, the white and gold of them at midday, the deep purple they turned for 20 minutes before the sun finally cleared the peaks in the evening, which was the most extraordinary light she had ever seen and which she had been standing in the open long enough to notice now, because she was somewhere she felt safe enough to look up. She wrote one sentence about the cup of mint tea that had appeared outside her door in the middle of the night, without explanation and without any request for acknowledgement. She underlined it. Someone in this house knows how to notice a thing without turning the noticing into something a person has to manage. She closed the journal and then set it flat on the desk, turned the lamp down until the flame went out. The room went dark around her, and through the window, the night sky over Colorado was enormous, packed with stars, in the way that the sky only is at altitude, each one sharp and cold, and exactly where it had always been. She lay in the bed in the corner room with the new curtains shifting in the 2 inches of open window above her head. She did not count anything. For the first time in a longer period than she could accurately name, she let the darkness simply be darkness. Not a container for waiting, not a space with something approaching through it, just the natural condition of a mountain night after the lamp goes out. She lay in the stillness of it, And after a while, that was longer than she had expected and shorter than she had feared. She closed her eyes and slept. The second week on the Hargrove Ranch moved differently from the first. The first week had been a careful negotiation. Four people in a house learning the unspoken rules of each other's presence without yet having the language for any of it. The second week had a different quality. The rules were beginning to form without anyone announcing them. Nora took the early morning shift at the coffee pot. Reed kept the barn conversation going because silence made him restless, and she had decided she could tolerate Reed's particular brand of talking, which was always about something concrete and never about anything personal, unless it had to be. Lyle cooked. Boone fixed things that needed fixing and watched the road south from whatever height gave him the best view without being obvious about watching. On the 12th day, Lyle came out of the tool storage room attached to the south side of the barn and found her waiting. She was sitting on the splitting block with her journal closed on her knee and her eyes on the mountain ridge, and she had the particular stillness of a person who has been waiting a deliberate amount of time and is prepared to continue waiting. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she turned her head. "I found the box," she said. He had known this was coming. He had known it since the morning he noticed the box had been moved 2 inches from where he kept it and then replaced 2 inches to the left of its original position. A displacement so small that he might have convinced himself he had imagined it, except that he had not imagined it. He came out and sat down on the sawbuck a few feet from her. "Which letters did you read?" he said. "All 6. He looked at his hands for a moment. They were the hands of a man who worked outside in all weather, rough at the palms and stained at the knuckles. Not at all the hands you would associate with the kind of careful writing he had put into those letters, which was part of why the letters had surprised even him when he reread them after sending them. He had not known he had that much to say until he was saying it to someone who was asking the right questions. "The handwriting," she said. "You and Boone write nothing alike." "No," he agreed. "I noticed on the second week. I had seen Boone write on the supply list. Yours slopes differently. You press lighter on the upstroke." Lyle was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have signed my own name." "Yes," she said, "you should have." No anger in it, no injury, just the statement of a fact that both of them could see clearly from where they were sitting. "Why didn't you?" she said. He thought about how to say it accurately. "Because if I signed it my own name and you came here and did not want this, the rejection would have a specific address. Boone's name put distance between me and the outcome." He paused. It was a coward's calculation. She considered that. "The last line," she said, "the one about taking me home if I was not happy. Was that yours too?" "Yes." She opened the journal and turned to a page near the back. He could see writing there but could not read it from where he sat. "That sentence was the reason I answered the advertisement," she said. "Not the ranch, not Colorado. That one sentence. Because the man who writes something like that is thinking about the woman in the arrangement as someone with the right to be unhappy." She closed the journal again. "I read 26 other advertisements before I found yours. None of them thought about that." Lyle looked at the mountains above the tree line where the rock was bare and gray and indifferent to everything below it. "I read your letters more than once," he said. "More than several times." "I know." He looked at her. "The creases," she said. "When a letter has been folded and unfolded many times, the paper shows it. Yours were soft at the folds." She stood up from the splitting block and tucked the journal under her arm. "I am not angry, Lyle. I just needed you to know that I know." She walked back toward the house, and he sat on the sawbuck and looked at the toolroom door standing open behind him. The box was on the second shelf where it always was. Inside it, 6 letters in her careful handwriting and 6 in his arranged in the order they had come, which was the order he had put them in back in the winter, when this had still seemed like something that might not happen. He sat there for a long time after she was gone. 3 days after that, Doc Harmon rode in from the north on his way back from checking a family up in the high pasture country who kept getting sick with things they should have vaccinated against. He was 62 years old and had been practicing medicine in Copper Ridge since the town had fewer than 100 people in it, and he had the unhurried quality of a man who has delivered enough bad news in his time to know that hurrying never improved any of it. He tied his horse at the fence post and came up to the porch where Boone was reinforcing the corner rail that had loosened in the last hard wind. "Coffee if you have it," Doc said. "We have it." They sat on the porch with the coffee and talked about the weather and the state of the road north and the prospects for the fall cattle work, which were the things as two men who have known each other since one was 19 and the other was 45 talk about when they are working toward the thing they actually came to say. Doc set his cup down on the rail. "The young woman," he said, "Miss Ellis." Boone kept his hands on the coffee cup. "She came to see me," Doc said, 3 days after she arrived here, said she had sustained some injuries in transit and wanted them documented. He was quiet for a moment looking at the mountains. "I examined her. I wrote down what I found in the examination record the way I write down everything I find in an examination record. The language is clinical. That is what examination records are written in." He looked at Boone now directly. "She told me at the end of the visit that she wanted the record to exist. Those were her exact words. She wanted the record to exist. She did not say why she might need it. She said she might not ever need it, but she wanted it to be there." Boone was very still. "I do not share an examination records with anyone who does not have a medical reason to see them," Doc said. "That is a principle I hold, but I am telling you that the record exists and that I know what is in it, and that if a situation arose in which the contents of that record became relevant to a legal proceeding of any kind, I would have an obligation to respond to a properly issued request." He picked his cup back up. "I am telling you this because you are a man who thinks through situations before they arrive, and because I have been in this town long enough to know when something is building, and I would rather the people on the right side of it have time to think." The porch was quiet. Below the fence line, the valley stretched south green and gold in the morning light, and 12 miles beyond the edge of the visible valley sat Copper Ridge, with whatever was gathering inside it. "How old were those injuries?" Boone said. "Some were recent, some were not." Doc finished his coffee. "She is a careful woman. Careful in the way that people become careful when the alternative has cost them something." He stood, set his cup on the rail, and shook Boone's hand. He rode back down the road toward town, and Boone sat alone on the porch for a while after he was gone. Then he went inside and got his hat and his horse and rode into Copper Ridge. Sheriff Frank Holt was behind his desk when Boone came in. Frank was a compact man with gray entering his hair on both sides and the kind of face that had started out looking younger than it was and had spent 20 years catching up to its actual age. He had been running the sheriff's office in Copper Ridge for 12 years and had developed the specific quality of attention that comes from spending more than a decade watching a small community from the inside. He knew the difference between people looking for justice and people looking for a place to put blame, and he generally knew which kind was standing in front of him within the first 3 minutes. Boone explained the situation without embellishment, the document that had arrived, the shaking signature, what Nora had told him about the conditions under which the signing had occurred. He laid the folded document on the desk. Frank read it, all of it. Then he opened his desk drawer and brought out another document, this one official with the stamp of the Territorial Court Office in the upper left corner. Arthur Crane, Frank said, Denver businessman. He filed this with the county land office 11 days ago. Mineral rights petition for approximately 80 acres of property south of town along the river. Property registered to a deceased party named Ellen Whitmore. He set it on the desk next to the document Boone had brought, with an attached authorization signed by Nora Ellis. The two signatures sat side by side on the desk between them, both of them in the same unsteady hand. How did you get this? Boone said. Crane filed it through the proper channels. It is public record once filed. Frank looked at the signatures. I pulled it because the land office clerk mentioned the name on the property, and I looked it up and found that the registered heir is a minor living in Kansas, or was living in Kansas until recently. He looked at Boone. Crane is here. He arrived 3 days ago. He is staying at Fowler's boarding house. Boone absorbed this without moving his expression. There is something else, Frank said. I received a telegraph message this morning from the sheriff's office in Dodge City. A man named Wade Ellis sent word that he is traveling to Colorado on family business and expects to arrive within the week. Frank looked at Boone with the particular steadiness of a man who does not dress up bad news. The timing is not a coincidence. No, Boone said, it is not. Frank folded his hands on the desk. The documents as they stand have a legitimate surface. Without evidence of the conditions under which they were signed, the court will treat them as valid instruments. Signatures are signatures under territorial law. A pause. If the woman can testify about the circumstances of signing, and if that testimony is credible and supported by evidence, the instruments can be challenged. But it requires her to make that case formally. She would have to stand up in front of people and say it. Yes. Boone picked up the document he had brought and folded it again. He looked at the mineral rights petition still lying on the desk, at Nora's signature on the bottom of it, shaking in the same way as the other one. How much time do we have before this needs to move one way or the other? He said. Crane has filed. That starts a clock on the county review. You have approximately 2 weeks before the review becomes a default approval. Frank met his eyes. If Ellis gets here first and applies pressure in the wrong direction, that timeline could become complicated. Boone stood. Thank you, Frank. I am not doing you a favor, Frank said. I am doing my job. He looked at the documents on his desk, which sometimes looks like the same thing from where you are standing. He stopped at Fowler's boarding house on the way back to the hitching rail. Mags Fowler was behind the front desk, sorting mail into room slots when he came through the door. She looked up at him over her reading glasses with the expression of someone who was not surprised to see him and had been expecting him to appear at some point in the near future. You know why I am here, he said. I know why you are here, she agreed. She set the mail down. Room 4. He went out an hour ago. He has been going out each afternoon and coming back by supper. He does not talk to anyone more than necessary. He eats alone. She paused. He has a map. He leaves it face down on the desk when he goes out, but the desk cloth is marked where it sits. It is a large map folded in quarters. Has he asked about the Hargrove place? He asked about the road north from town on his second day. He asked how far the ranches ran in that direction and whether the properties were generally settled or still open country. She looked at Boone steadily. He did not ask about your family by name. He did not need to. Boone looked at the row of room keys hanging behind her. "He has not done anything I can object to," she said. "He is a paying guest who minds his business and stays within the law. I cannot remove him on the basis of suspicion." She paused. "But I can tell you what I observe. And I observe a man who came here for a specific purpose and is waiting for a specific moment." "That is useful," Boone said. "It is all I have to offer." He thanked her and went back to his horse and rode up the 12 miles of mountain road to the ranch. The ride gave him time to think through the shape of what was gathering. He had the habit of doing his clearest thinking on horseback, which his father had also had, a fact his father had attributed to the particular quality of silence that existed between a man and a horse that trusted him. By the time he came up the road and saw the fence line and the corner of the barn and the smoke from the kitchen chimney, he had the shape of it. Not the full resolution, but the shape. He put the horse in the barn and went to find his brothers. They sat on the back porch after supper, the three of them, while the light ran out of the sky above the eastern ridge in the valley below, went from gold to purple to the gray-blue of mountain evening. Nora had gone up to the corner room. Her lamp was on. Through the kitchen window they could see the small light at the top of the stairs. Boone told them what Frank had said, what Mags had said, what Doc had said in the general outline of it, without the specifics that were not his to share. He told it plain and in order, and without editorializing, the way he had learned from his father that serious information deserves to be delivered. Reed listened until Boone was finished and then said, "Wade Ellis is 3 days out at most. We should ride to meet him before he gets here." "And do what?" Boone said. "Tell him to turn around." "On what authority?" Reed was quiet for a moment, which was not his natural state. "On the authority of 3 men who are not going to let him through that gate. That is not authority under the law. That is 3 men blocking a road which gives him every legal argument he needs to take this in the direction he wants it to go." Boone looked at the valley. "He comes here with a harassment complaint, and suddenly we are the ones in the wrong place." "So we do nothing," Reed said. "I did not say that." "Then what did you say?" Lyle had been sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and had not spoken yet. Now he looked up. "The decision about what happens next is not ours to make," he said. "Not entirely." Both brothers looked at him. "She came here with it, like the," Lyle said. "Us. I do not know all of it yet, but she has been managing this situation longer than any of us have been aware of it. She knew about the land before she arrived. She went to Doc on the 3rd day and asked him to document what he found. She has been writing things down in that journal every night since she got here." He looked at Boone. "She is not waiting for us to solve this. She is waiting to see whether we are the kind of men she can solve it alongside." The porch was quiet after that for a long enough moment that the creek at the edge of the property could be heard clearly in the dark below. "So we talk to her," Boone said. "We tell her what is coming," Lyle said. "We do not make the plan for her. We tell her what we know, and we let her tell us what she knows, and then we decide together what the next step looks like." Reed stood up and walked to the edge of the porch and stood looking out at the dark of the valley. He was 27 years old, and his instincts were the instincts of a man who has always resolved things directly and found that direct resolution generally worked. The instinct to ride out and meet a threat before it arrived at your property line was not a wrong instinct. It was simply not the only instinct available, and sometimes it was not the correct one. He turned around. "All right," he said. "We talked to her first." They talked to her at breakfast the next morning. All 3 of them at the table, the document from the county land office in the center of it, and Boone walking her through what Frank had told him and what Mags had seen, and what the timeline looked like from the legal side. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she looked at the mineral rights petition and at her own signature at the bottom of it for a long moment. "I did not sign this one," she said. "You did not know about this one. I knew my father had been asking me to sign things for 2 years. I did not know what all of them were. Some of them were what he said they were. Some were not." She touched the edge of the document without picking it up. "This one I do not remember," which means he likely produced it at a moment when I was not in a position to be careful. She looked up. He had a method. He would wait until I was frightened or exhausted or had been locked in for long enough that I would sign anything to make the immediate situation stop. 3 times she had started to say something specific, and 3 times had arrived at it sideways through the edge of the actual fact rather than its center. Boone recognized this. It was the way people approached the part of a story that they had not yet said out loud to anyone. "You do not have to tell us the details," he said. "I know," she said, "but I think I need to." She set both hands flat on the table. "He locked me in the storage room at the back of the house. Sometimes for a night, sometimes longer. 3 times a day he would come to the door." She stopped. That was the pattern. Morning, midday, evening. 3 times. I counted them because counting was something to do. I counted them for long enough that the number 3 stopped being a number and became something else. A shape. Something I recognized in the dark. The kitchen was very still. "The marks on the wagon door," Reed said. She looked at him. "The inside grab rail," he said. "3 cuts in the wood. I saw them the night you arrived." Something moved in her face that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "I made those on the road from Dodge City," she said, "to remind myself that those 3 were behind me. Not ahead, behind." She looked at her hands on the table. "He would come to the door and require me to sign things and then leave again. I could not read what I was signing in the dark. I signed what he put in front of me because the alternative was remaining in the room." Nobody spoke. "I am telling you this," she said, "because you deserve to understand the actual situation, not a version of it that is easier to hear." She looked at Boone directly. "And because I think what is coming is going to require all of us to be clear about what actually happened." Boone looked at the document on the table, at the signatures that shook. "Wade Ellis arrives within the week," he said, "likely sooner." "I know. And Arthur Crane is already in Copper Ridge." Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes went very still, in the way that things go still just before a large decision settles into place. "Then we do not have much time," she said. "Wade Ellis arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 days earlier than Frank Holt's estimate, riding in from the south on a horse that had been pushed harder than it should have been. He brought 2 men with him, neither of whom looked like they had been hired for their conversational abilities. He came through the gate without stopping to announce himself, which told Boone everything he needed to know about how Ellis intended to conduct the visit. Reed saw them first from the roof of the barn, where he had gone up to check the work Boone had done on the south face. He was down the ladder before the riders had cleared the fence line and around the corner of the barn in time to take up his position to the right of the porch stairs before his brothers came out of the house. Lyle came through the kitchen door and onto the porch. Boone came out a step behind him. Nora came out behind them both, which none of them had discussed, and all of them had somehow expected. Wade Ellis hauled his horse to a stop in the yard and looked at the arrangement of people on and around the porch with the calculation of a man who had not arrived to negotiate. He was 52 years old, and he looked it with the particular worn quality of a man who has been making poor decisions for long enough that each one has left a mark. His coat was decent. His posture was the practiced posture of a man who had learned that confidence in the posture could substitute for confidence in the position. "My daughter," he said, looking past the brothers to where Nora stood, "I am here to take her home." "She is home," Reed said. Ellis looked at Reed with the precise degree of dismissal that a man of his type used to communicate that he did not intend to be addressed by someone he considered subordinate to the conversation. Then he looked at Boone. "The marriage arrangement has not been completed according to legal requirements," he said. "Until it is, she remains under my authority as her legal guardian. I am here to exercise that authority." "She is 19 years old," Boone said. "She is unmarried, and the contract under which she traveled here has not been fulfilled by either party. Under territorial law, that gives me standing." He shifted in the saddle. "I am not here to argue law with a rancher. I am here to collect my daughter." Nora came forward between Lyle and Boone, not by being ushered, but by choosing to move. She came to the top of the porch steps and stood there looking down at her father with an expression that had nothing performative in it. No anger displayed for effect, no effort to project something she did not feel. Just a woman looking at a man she had spent 19 years figuring out and had finally finished figuring out. "I am not going with you," she said. "Nora." "I am not going with you," she said again, with exactly the same weight in it the second time as the first. Ellis looked at her for a moment. Then he did the thing he always did when a direct approach failed. He changed the angle. He dismounted and took 2 steps toward the porch and reached up toward her arm with the practiced grip of a man who had used that grip enough times to have optimized it. Reed moved before the hand made contact. He stepped from the right side of the porch stairs and put himself between Ellis and the step with the specific directness of a man who has decided where the line is and is standing on it. He did not shout. He did not swing. He put himself in the space and stayed there. Ellis's left-hand man came in from the side. He had been waiting for exactly this moment, positioned to take advantage of the moment when the younger man committed himself to a single direction. He came in hard from Reed's blind side, and the impact was solid enough to knock Reed into the porch rail. The rail held. Reed did not go down, but he went sideways and hit the support post with his right side, and the sound it made was not the sound of a man who had absorbed the impact cleanly. Lyle came off the porch in 1 step and took the left-hand man at the shoulder with both hands and redirected him into the fence post at the corner of the yard with the efficiency of a man who has been doing physical work his entire life and understands how leverage operates. The man hit the post and sat down in the dirt. Boone came down the stairs and took 3 steps across the yard and had Ellis by the coat before the man could remount. He did not drag him. He held him in place with the specific grip of a man who was making a point through his hands rather than his voice. The third man, who had been hanging back on his horse at the gate, looked at the 2 men now on the ground at Reed, still upright against the post with his right hand pressed to his side at Boone, holding his employer by the coat, and made the calculation that most men in his situation eventually make. He stayed on his horse. Ellis looked at Boone from the distance of about 18 inches, close enough to see that Boone was not angry, close enough to see something more controlled than anger, which is more difficult to look at. "You are making a legal mistake," Ellis said. "The mistake in this yard is yours," Boone said. He released the coat and stepped back 2 paces, not because he was done, but because he wanted Ellis to understand the distance was a choice and not a necessity. Ellis straightened his coat. He looked at his 2 men, one on the ground and one still on a horse. He looked at the porch where Nora stood. He had the expression of a man who had arrived with a pawn and found the plan insufficient and was now trying to locate the exit that cost him the least. She signed the document, he said to the yard in general. Whatever she tells you, she signed them. That is a matter of legal record. Nora spoke from the porch. I signed them in the dark, she said. In the storage room where you kept me. You put the pen in my hand and told me what each document was and lied about what they contained. I signed them because I was afraid of what happened when I did not comply. She was not shouting. She was not performing. She was delivering facts in the voice of someone who has organized the facts carefully and is presenting them in order. Morning, midday, evening, 3 times a day for as long as I can remember. I kept count. I kept very careful count. The yard was silent. Ellis looked at his daughter on the porch with an expression that moved through several things quickly, none of them simple. He had known this moment was coming eventually. He had not precisely imagined it looking like this. I will see you in a courtroom, he said. His voice had lost the practiced authority it had carried on his way in. Then that is where we will see each other, she said. He mounted his horse. His 2 men collected themselves, the one from the ground, moving with the caution of a man who has been introduced to a fence post by his ribs. They went back through the gate and down the road south without looking back. The dust of their leaving settled slowly in the still morning air. Boone turned to look at Reed, who was still standing at the post with his right hand against his side. The hand was pressed too deliberately for the injury to be minor. Let me see, Boone said. It is fine, Reed said. Let me see it. Reed moved his hand. The right side of his shirt had pulled against where he had hit the post, and there was a spreading tightness to the fabric that was doing its best to tell a story without words. Boone put his hand on his youngest brother's shoulder and walked him toward the house. Reed allowed this without comment, which told Boone more about the pain than any outward sign would have. Nora had come down from the porch by the time they reached the steps. She looked at Reed's side and then at Boone. I have done this before, she said. Let me. She did not wait for agreement. She went inside and came back with clean cloth and the small medical kit that every household in mountain country maintained because the nearest doctor was 12 miles down a road that was sometimes impassable. She sat Reed down on the porch steps and examined the injury with hands that were steady and competent and professional in a way that did not announce itself. 2 ribs, it turned out, not broken but badly enough bruised that Reed sat still without argument while she worked, which was its own kind of testament to the condition they were in. You have done this before, Reed said. Yes, she said. He did not ask under what circumstances. She did not explain. There was a mutual understanding in that exchange that required no further words. When she finished, he sat with his hands on his knees and looked out at the road where the dust had finally settled. She began to pack away the kit. Take the rifle when we ride out, he said, starting tomorrow. On the saddle right side. She looked at him. All of us, he said, including you. Every time. She looked at the rifle rack visible through the open main room door. Then she looked at Reed. I will need more practice, she said. Then we practice, he said, and stood up carefully and went inside. Lyle stood in the yard and watched the south road where the dust had settled completely now. Boone stood at the corner of the porch and looked at the gate and thought about the man who had just ridden through it and the courtroom he had promised on his way out. Frank Holt arrived the following morning before the ranch had fully woken up. He rode in at a pace that suggested his visit was purposeful without being urgent, which was Frank's way of communicating in advance that the news he carried was important, but not immediately catastrophic. Boone was on the porch with his first coffee when Frank came through the gate, and he poured a second cup and handed it over before Frank had finished dismounting. Tell me, Boone said. Frank sat down in the other porch chair and looked at the valley for a moment the way he always did when he was organizing what he wanted to say and the order in which he wanted to say it. I requested the county banking records yesterday, he said, not as a routine matter. I had reason to suspect a financial connection between Crane and Ellis that was relevant to the documents filed with the land office. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The county bank had records of a wire transfer from an Arthur Crane of Denver to a Wade Ellis of Dodge City 8 months ago. The notation on the transfer reads arrangement fee. He paused. 8 months ago would be approximately when the advertisement appeared in the Kansas Prairie Gazette. Boone looked at the mountains. That is not conclusive by itself, Frank continued. A wire transfer notation is not a confession, but it establishes a financial relationship between the man who filed for mineral rights and the man who is the legal guardian of the property heir. That relationship goes to the question of whether the documents were produced through legitimate independent agreement or through coordinated pressure. It is a thread, Boone said. It is a thread that pulls in a direction. Frank drank his coffee. I also spoke with Mags Fowler this morning. She has information about Crane's behavior at the boarding house that I am adding to my own file. Between the financial record and the conduct pattern, I have enough to request a formal hearing before the county magistrate. He looked at Boone directly. I asked Mags to be present at the hearing. She agreed without requiring further explanation. What does the hearing require from our side? Boone said. It requires Nora Ellis to give formal testimony about the circumstances under which the documents were signed. It requires that testimony to be specific and consistent, and it requires any supporting evidence to be presented at the time of the hearing. Frank set his cup on the rail. If you have any supporting evidence, this would be the moment to know about it. There is a medical record, Boone said. Doc Harmon. Frank nodded slowly as if this was something he had suspected was available and was relieved to have confirmed. I will speak to Doc, he said. The hearing would be 5 days from now. That is the soonest the magistrate can convene. Boone thought about that. 5 days was enough time for Crane to understand that his petition was being challenged. It was enough time for Ellis to return if he chose to. It was enough time for things to become more complicated than they currently were, and not enough time to do much about the complication. She will testify, Boone said. It was not a question. He was not answering for her. He was stating what he already knew. Frank stood and picked up his hat from the post where he had hung it. I would have it no other way, he said. Her voice in that room is what makes this a case rather than a complaint. He rode back down the road toward town. Boone sat on the porch until the sound of the horse was gone and the mountain quiet returned, and then he went inside to find her. She was at the desk in the corner room. The door was open, which she had not left it before. The leather journal was in front of her, but she was not writing. She was looking out the window at the morning light on the ridge. He knocked on the door frame. She turned. 5 days, he said. She nodded. He came to the doorway but did not come in. Frank needs your testimony, specific, about the circumstances of each document you are aware of, including the conditions under which you signed. I know, she said. It will require you to say things in a room with other people that you have only said in this kitchen. I know that too. He looked at the journal on the desk. Is there anything in there that would be useful? Any record of dates or specific circumstances? She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the journal and held it out toward him across the desk. Read from the marked pages, she said. The ribbons. I put them in this morning. He came into the room and took the journal. He sat in the chair by the window and read. She stood by the desk and looked out at the ridge and did not watch him read, which he understood as a form of respect, That also happened to be a form of courage. He read for a long time. The journal was precise in a way he had not anticipated. Not emotional in the way that private writing often is, not a record of feelings, but a record of events. Dates, specific details set down with the particular care of someone who has understood for a long time that the record might actually need to stand on its own. The page for March 14th was the one that mattered most to the legal situation. The date, the circumstances of the room, the specific words her father had used to describe the document he required her to sign. The fact that she had asked to read it first and been told there was no time. The fact that the lamp was insufficient and her hands were shaking. The fact that she had written it all down immediately after on the night it happened, before anything had had time to alter the clarity of the memory. There were other pages, earlier dates, a pattern that the pages described without ever using the word pattern. He read those too all the way through. When he looked up, she was still at the window. "You planned to leave before you answered the advertisement," he said. "Yes." "How far back does the planning go?" She looked at him over her shoulder. "The journal with the planning notes is in the trunk. This is the daily record. The planning one is smaller green cover, if you want to see it." He looked at the journal in his hands. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight this is enough." She turned from the window and looked at him directly. "I did not come here because I had nowhere to go," she said. "I want you to be clear about that, not as reassurance, as fact." "I am clear about that," he said. "Are you?" He thought about Eleanor for the last time that would matter in this story. He thought about standing at the closed gate after her wagon was gone and what he had decided in that moment about the nature of choosing. He thought about what it actually meant when a person chose something rather than accepted it, and how different those two things look from the inside. He thought about a woman who had read 26 advertisements and rejected 25 of them before writing a single letter, and about the specific sentence that had made her decide to write. "Yes," he said, "I am clear." He set the journal on the desk and stood up. At the door, he turned back. "In 5 days," he said, "you will not be standing there alone." She looked at him with the measuring eyes she had brought off the wagon on the day she arrived, the eyes that assessed before they trusted. She nodded once. "I know," she said. The night before the hearing, the ranch was quiet in the specific way that a place becomes quiet when the people in it have each decided to carry the weight of the coming day, alone until morning makes it shared. Boone walked the fence line at dusk, the way his father had walked it, checking for things that needed attending to, and then walked it again when nothing he found required immediate attention because the walking was what he needed and the fence line was only the reason. Reed sat on the porch with his right arm resting carefully against his side and watched the southern road and said nothing, which for Reed was the loudest possible form of communication. Lyle stayed in the kitchen after supper and did not pretend to read. He sat at the table with a cup of coffee that went cold while he looked at the middle distance and thought about a woman in Dodge City who had read his letter enough times to wear the fold soft, and about what that meant in terms of what he owed her now. He thought about the last line he had written: "If you are not happy after 6 months, we will take you home." He had written it because it was true and because he believed it. He had not imagined when he wrote it that the woman who read it would be counting it the same way she had once counted the hours in a locked room, as evidence that somewhere someone believed she had the right to choose. In the corner room, the lamp burned at the desk. She wrote in it for a long time, setting down the shape of the day with the careful attention she always brought to the record, because the record was the one thing in her life that had always been entirely hers. She wrote the date at the top of the page. She wrote one sentence: Tomorrow I say it out loud. Then she closed the journal and turned down the lamp and lay in the dark of the corner room with the mountain night pressing against the window, glass enormous and cold and full of stars. She did not count anything. She did not need to count anything. 5 days from now, everything would be different in one direction or another, and there was no way to know in advance which direction it would go. What she knew lying in the dark in the corner room that smelled of fresh plaster and new curtain cotton and the pine smoke from the kitchen below was that she had done everything she was capable of doing to arrive at tomorrow prepared. The journal was there. The record was there. Doc Harmon's documentation was there. And in the rooms down the hall and on the porch below, 3 men who had proven in a yard with her father's people that they understood the difference between standing beside someone and standing in front of them. She had read 26 advertisements before she found the one she answered. She thought she had aimed correctly. Tomorrow she would find out. The 3 days before the hearing had a specific quality, the way days have a specific quality when everyone in a house knows what is coming and has decided not to talk about it more than necessary. On the second morning before the hearing, Boone went to check the north fence line and found her already there walking the fence on the inside, checking the post bases the way he had shown her on the first day she had come out to help. She had a way of watching a task being done and then doing it the same way the next time without being reminded, which was a quality he had noticed and thought about. He fell in beside her without announcement, and they walked the fence together for a long time without talking. The valley below was green in the morning light, and the mountains above it were doing the thing they did in the early hours when the angle of the sun caught the snow on the high faces and turned it briefly gold before the light shifted and the mountains became themselves again. "I wanted to tell you something," she said eventually. "Tell me." She stopped at a post that had shifted slightly from the frost heave in the ground beneath it. She pressed her boot against the base of it, testing the give. "I know you have told yourself that what happened with Eleanor means something general about women in this place," she said. "I think you probably need to stop telling yourself that." He looked at her. "Not because it is wrong to draw lessons from experience," she said, "but because the lesson you drew is too broad. It does not fit the situation you are actually in." She looked at the post she was testing, then at the mountains. "Eleanor made a choice that was right for Eleanor. That is not a lesson about women. That is a lesson about Eleanor." The two things are not the same. He did not answer for a moment. Then he crouched down and took the post in both hands and worked it back into its proper angle. "You are right," he said. "I know I am." He looked up at her from the crouch with an expression that was as close as Boone Hargrove came to being surprised. She was not smiling. She was looking at the mountains in the same way she had looked at the ranch roof on the evening she arrived, with the evaluating attention of someone who takes the measure of a thing before committing an opinion to it. "The roof pitch," he said. She looked down at him. "What about it?" "The first thing you said when you got off the wagon. You looked at the house and you talked about the roof pitch. It is a good roof pitch. What were you actually doing?" She considered this for a moment. "I was deciding whether the people who built this place knew what they were doing," she said. "A roof tells you something about a builder, whether they thought about the problem they were solving or just followed a pattern. This roof is thought about." She looked back at the house from the fence line. "It told me something." He stood up from the post, brushed the dirt from his hands. They walked the rest of the fence line in silence, which by now was a silence that had become comfortable in the specific way that comfort arrives not through shared words, but through shared time and shared work, in the gradual understanding that the silence does not require filling. On the last afternoon before the hearing, Reed took her to the eastern field. His right side was still not fully healed. He moved with the careful adjustment of a man managing pain without announcing it, which was the only way Reed knew how to manage anything. He had the rifle over his left shoulder and walked with his right arm slightly out from his body to avoid the pressure against the bruised ribs. She noticed and did not comment. He set up the targets at 40 yards the same way he always had, three fence posts with tin cans balanced on top, and handed her the rifle. She took it with both hands, settled the stock against her right shoulder, and looked down the barrel with the focused quiet of someone who has been doing this long enough that the mechanics no longer require conscious attention. She fired. The first can went off the first post. The second shot missed the second post by a hand's width. The third shot caught the top edge of the third can and sent it spinning into the grass. 2 of 3, Reed said. 2 of 3, she agreed. He walked out to reset the cans and came back. His right hand went to his side once briefly when he bent down to pick up the fallen can, and she watched this from behind the rifle without making anything of it. "You should not have gone into the middle of that," she said. "Yes, I should have," he said. "Your ribs say differently." "My ribs are not in charge." He came back and stood beside her again. She raised the rifle, settled, fired 3 times at a tempo that showed she was beginning to trust the consistency of the rifle's pull and was compensating for it correctly. 3 cans, 3 shots. Reed looked at the empty posts, looked at her. She was looking down the barrel at where the cans had been with an expression that was not triumph. It was closer to the quiet satisfaction of a person who has worked at something difficult and found that the work has produced the expected result. "You are a quick learner," he said. "I had a good teacher," she said. She lowered the rifle and held it out to him. "Rest that side tonight." "You should not tell me what to do," he said. "Someone should," she said. He took the rifle and they walked back toward the house through the evening grass, and he did not tell her she was wrong because she was not wrong, which was a thing Reed Hargrove found easier to accept in practice than in principle. That night late, when Reed had gone to bed and Boone was finishing the last of his rounds outside, Lyle came down to the kitchen and found her at the table with the journal closed in front of her and her hands around a cup that had gone cold. He rebuilt the fire under the coffee pot without being asked. When the coffee was ready, he set a fresh cup in front of her and took the old one away and sat down across the table. She looked at him. "I am not afraid of tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "I want you to know that. Not as reassurance, as fact." He wrapped his hands around his own cup. "I believe you." Outside the window, the mountain dark was total, and the stars were the only light for miles in any direction. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. The house held the warmth of a full day in its walls the way a house does when it has been lived in long enough to know how. "The last line in the advertisement," she said, "the one about taking me home." He looked at her. "I want you to know that I do not need it anymore," she said. "Not because there is nothing left to go back to, because I am not going anywhere." Lyle was quiet for a moment. The fire ticked. "That is good to know," he said. She picked up the cup and drank the coffee, and they sat at the table in the kitchen of the Hargrove Ranch for a long time without talking. Two people who understood by now that some forms of company do not require words to be real. The hearing convened at 9 in the morning in the front room of Frank Holt's office, which was the largest room in any official building in Copper Ridge and still only barely large enough for everyone who needed to be present. Arthur Crane sat to the left with his lawyer from Denver, a man named Aldridge who wore the clothing of a city professional and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had won arguments in rooms like this many times and expected to win this one. Crane himself was composed in the way that men are composed when they have prepared extensively and trust their preparation. He had not, as far as anyone could tell, been significantly disturbed by the news that the hearing had been requested. Wade Ellis sat to the right alone. He had returned to Copper Ridge 2 days after his visit to the ranch. He looked like a man who has slept poorly for a week and is aware that his appearance communicates this, which was not the appearance he had planned to present. Frank Holt stood at the head of the room with the county magistrate's representative, a thin man from the county seat who had ridden up that morning and who carried the authority of the court in a leather satchel that he set on Frank's desk and did not open until he was ready. Nora sat in the center of the room in the single chair that had been placed there for the purpose. Not at a table, not behind anything. In the open center of the room where everyone present could see her and she could see everyone. The three Hargrove brothers stood against the back wall, not seated, standing. Boone in the center, Lyle to his right, Reed to his left, with his right arm at a careful angle. They were not there as protection. They were there as witnesses, as the three people in the room who knew the most complete version of the truth and whose presence communicated that fact without requiring anyone to say it. Mags Fowler sat in a chair along the left wall, hands folded in her lap, watching the room with the particular attention she brought to everything. Frank had asked her to be present, and she had agreed without requiring further explanation. When she came in, he indicated the chair, and that was the full extent of the arrangement between them, because after 20 years in the same town, they did not need more than that. Doc Harmon stood near the door with his medical bag and a folder of papers that he held against his chest with both hands. The magistrate's representative opened his satchel and arranged his papers and cleared his throat in the way that official proceedings always begin, with a sound that means things are about to become formal. Crane's lawyer went first. Aldridge was good at his work. He presented the mineral rights petition and the authorization document with the professional clarity of a man who understands that a judge or magistrate responds best to organization. He laid out the legal framework. The documents had been signed, the signatures were verified, the filing had followed proper procedure. The signer's subsequent discomfort with the terms was not under territorial law grounds to invalidate a properly executed agreement. He spoke for 11 minutes and did not use a single unnecessary word. Wade Ellis spoke after him. He had clearly intended to present himself as a concerned parent and managed it for approximately the first 3 sentences before the performance became audible, a performance to everyone in the room. He spoke about Nora's state of mind when she left Dodge City, her confusion, her susceptibility to the influence of strangers. He spoke about his legal standing as her guardian. He spoke about his desire for her welfare. By the end of the 2 minutes Frank allowed him, the room had the quality that rooms have when the people in them have collectively decided that what they are hearing is not true, but are waiting for the appropriate moment to say so. Frank looked at Nora. "Miss Ellis," he said, "you may speak." She stood. She did not bring the journal. She had offered it to Frank the previous day, and he had read the relevant sections and had it with him at his desk, and she had decided that she did not want to read from it in this room. She had decided she wanted to speak from herself. She stood in the center of the room and looked at Frank and spoke in the same voice she had used in the kitchen and on the porch and on the day she came off the wagon. Clear, unhurried, the voice of someone who has organized what they need to say and is saying it in order. She described the storage room, the door that locked from the outside, the pattern of 3 times a day that had governed a portion of her life for longer than she chose to quantify in this room. She described the documents. The specific circumstances of each signing she could clearly identify. The darkness, the instruction to sign without reading, the description of each document's supposed contents that turned out on examination later, not to match the actual contents. She described the March 14th document specifically and precisely with the date and the hour and the specific words her father had used to describe what it was and what it was not. She spoke for 9 minutes. Not one word in those 9 minutes was anything other than the truth as she had lived it, and the room understood this the way rooms understand when they are in the presence of testimony that is not performing itself. Frank asked her the question, Miss Ellis, the mineral rights authorization document that has been filed with the county land office and bears your signature. Did you sign that document of your own free will with full knowledge of its contents? The room was completely quiet. She looked at Frank directly. She looked at no one else. No, she said. One word. Exact. No tremor in it. No reaching for additional weight because the word already carried everything it needed to carry. Aldrich began to rise from his chair. Frank raised one hand without looking at him, and Aldridge, to his credit as a professional, sat back down. I have called one witness, Frank said, Margaret Fowler. Mag stood from the chair along the left wall and came to stand near the center of the room. She was 60 years old and had been running a boarding house in this town since before most of the people in the room had arrived in it. She was not nervous. She was not performing composure that she did not feel. She was simply a woman who had decided to be here and was here. Aldridge asked her to confirm what she had seen when the authorization document was signed. He asked it with the precision of a lawyer who believes he already knows the answer. She confirmed her presence. Yes, she had been there. Then she paused, a pause that was not hesitation but decision. I signed the witness line, she said. She looked at Frank, not at Aldridge. Wade Ellis came to my boarding house with the document. He told me his daughter had signed it willingly in Kansas and that he needed a local Colorado witness to make the filing valid at the county office. He told me it was a standard property formality and that I would only need to sign my name. I signed it. She paused. I did not witness the signing. I witnessed a father telling me his daughter had no objections, and I signed my name to that. Another pause longer this time. 3 days after I signed it, the girl came through my door asking to buy a bar of soap with coins. She counted out very carefully. She had the eyes of someone who had been watching doorways for a long time. I did not connect the two things until I was sitting in this room today. She looked at the magistrate's representative. I signed a document without knowing its contents on the word of a man who had arranged to deceive me. I did not know I was a participant in a fraud. I know it now, and I know the difference between those two things. The room was very still. Aldridge stood up. The witness previously indicated that the signing was conducted in a routine manner and that she observed nothing unusual. I indicated that the signing took place, Mag said, with the patience of a woman who has had to correct misunderstandings for 6 decades and has developed an efficient process for it. I did not indicate it was routine. Those are different statements. Frank let the correction stand in the room for a moment. Then he looked toward the door. I also have a medical record, he said. Dr. Harmon. Doc Harmon came forward and laid his papers on Frank's desk. He explained the contents without embellishment. A patient had come to his office presenting physical evidence of repeated injury. He had documented what he found in clinical terms, which he then read aloud in clinical terms, which had the effect of making the information both precise and undeniable. He noted that the patient had specifically requested that a record be created and kept on file. Aldridge conferred quietly with Crane. The conference lasted about 30 seconds. Then Arthur Crane did something that none of the preparation in the world could have prevented. because it was not a failure of preparation. It was a failure of temperament under sustained pressure, which is a different kind of failure and a more fundamental one. He stood up. He looked at Wade Ellis across the room with the expression of a man who has reached the end of his tolerance for incompetence in the people he has employed. This entire situation exists because you could not manage one straightforward task, he said. The professional composure was gone. What was underneath it was not rage exactly, but something colder, and in some ways more revealing. I paid you a substantial sum to ensure that the documentation was secured properly. I was explicit about what properly meant. You told me it was handled. He looked at the room that had gone absolutely still around him. I paid you to keep her compliant and available. That was the arrangement. The fact that you failed to execute it competently does not obligate me to absorb the consequences. The room stayed still for another full second. Then Frank Holt picked up the pen from his desk and wrote two words at the top of the document in front of him. He wrote with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been waiting for clarity to arrive and is recording it now that it has. He looked up. "Mr. Crane," he said, "you have just testified of your own accord and in the presence of a court officer that you engaged in a financial arrangement to coerce a minor into signing property documents without her full knowledge or consent. I am placing you under arrest pending a formal filing of charges." He looked at the deputy standing by the door. Then he looked at Ellis. "Mr. Ellis, you will remain as well." Ellis had gone the color of old ash. Aldridge closed his document case with the quiet efficiency of a man who recognizes when a case has moved beyond the point of professional intervention. The hearing was over. Nora stood in the center of the room and watched Frank's deputy move toward Crane. She did not look at her father. She looked at Frank completing his paperwork with the methodical care that Frank brought to everything he did officially, because he understood that official documents had to be right the first time. Then she looked at the three men standing against the back wall. Boone met her eyes. He did not nod. He did not make any gesture of conclusion or relief. He simply held her gaze with the steady attention he had brought to every moment since the day she arrived, and in that steadiness she read what it meant. It was not over yet. They came out of Frank's office into the late morning light of the Copper Ridge Main Street and turned toward the hitching rail and their horses. Nora had the journal under her arm. Lyle walked on her left, Reed on her right arm, still carefully positioned. Boone was half a step ahead, the way he always walked when he was thinking about what might be in front of them. The road north out of Copper Ridge runs straight for the first mile and then curves once before the long grade up into the mountain country begins. The curve was where the riders were waiting, 4 of them, positioned across the road on horseback with the specific arrangement of men who have chosen their ground in advance and know how to use it. They were not local men. Their horses were trail horses, not ranch horses, with the lean, well-traveled look of animals that have covered considerable distance recently. The men who sat them carried the same quality: professional, patient, hired. The lead rider was a compact man in his 40s, with a face that had learned over the years to show nothing that was not intentional. "Miss Ellis," he said. The voice was controlled and businesslike. "Mr. Crane requires a signature before his legal situation is concluded. This is the simplest possible way to resolve everything." Boone stopped his horse 10 yards from the line of riders. The others stopped behind and to either side of him. "Mr. Crane," Boone said, "is currently in the custody of the Copper Ridge Sheriff's Office. His legal situation is therefore time-sensitive," the rider said. "The document needs a signature today." Boone looked at the 4 men and their horses and the way they were positioned across the road. He looked at the steep ground to the left and the dry creek bed to the right. He ran the calculation the way he ran all calculations without hurrying it. "There are 4 of you," Reed said from his position to the right of Boone. "There are," the rider confirmed. "And 4 of us," Reed said. The rider's eyes moved to Nora. He had looked at her once when he began speaking, and then had looked away in the manner of someone who has assessed a situation and determined where the weak point is and where it is not. His assessment of where it was not turned out to be incorrect. Nora reached to the right side of her saddle without any sudden movement and brought the rifle up from its saddle position. She settled the stock against her right shoulder and rested the barrel at a downward angle that was not aimed at anyone but that required no additional movement to become aimed at anyone. "I am not going to sign anything," she said. The rider looked at her, at the rifle, at the way she held it, which was not the way a person holds a rifle when they have not used one enough to trust themselves with it. "That is a more complicated situation than Mr. Crane anticipated," the rider said. "Mr. Crane misjudged several things," she said. Boone moved his horse 3 steps to the left. Lyle moved right. The movement was not dramatic, but it was precise, the kind of movement that 2 men make when they have spent enough time working together in close quarters to know each other's instincts. The geometry of the road changed slightly and not in the rider's favor. Reed moved his horse forward 2 steps. He was 27 years old and his right side had 2 damaged ribs in it, and he was the youngest of the 3 brothers and the least inclined toward patience as a strategy. He moved his horse forward with the steady deliberateness of a man who has decided where he is and is not planning to be anywhere else. The lead rider looked at the configuration in front of him. 4 people had become a loose arc. The road behind them was clear. The ground on both sides was workable, but not advantageous. The woman with the rifle had not moved the barrel from its angled position, and he had been doing this work long enough to know that a person who does not shift a weapon when challenged either does not know how to use it or is comfortable enough with it that shifting is unnecessary. His read on which one applied here had changed since the conversation began. From behind them, from the direction of Copper Ridge, came the sound of hooves. One horse moving at a canter, the particular rhythm of a horse being ridden with purpose rather than urgency. Frank Holt came around the curve and brought his horse to a stop at the edge of the standoff with the unhurried precision of a man who has arrived at difficult situations often enough to know that the first thing he needs to communicate is that he is not alarmed by what he sees. He looked at the 4 riders, at the Hargrove group, at Nora with the rifle. His expression did not change. "Weapons displayed," he said to the lead rider. "Threats made against private citizens on a public road in the presence of a sworn officer. I am detaining all 4 of you." He looked at the deputy who had ridden up behind him. "Take them." The lead rider looked at his men. He had assessed the math of the situation well enough to arrive at a conclusion similar to the one his employer had reached in Frank's office an hour earlier. The calculation did not favor resistance. They came in without further argument, 4 men whose contract had turned out to cost considerably more than the rate they had agreed to, and were escorted back into Copper Ridge with the quiet efficiency that Frank Holt brought to all procedural matters. When the road was clear, Frank looked at the 4 people remaining on their horses. He looked at Reed. "How is the side?" he said. "Fine," Reed said. Frank looked at the way Reed was sitting his horse. "Right," he said in the tone of a man who has accepted an answer he does not entirely believe but will not argue with in the current moment. He looked at Nora and the rifle still in her hands. 3 of 3, she said, answering the question he had not asked. "I see that," he said. "You can put it down now." She lowered the rifle and settled it back against the saddle. Frank turned his horse and rode back toward Copper Ridge, and the four of them turned north and rode up the mountain road to the ranch, and nobody said much for the 12 miles because the ride itself was what the 12 miles required. The days that followed moved with the particular pace of aftermath, which is different from the pace of crisis and different again from the pace of ordinary life. It is the pace of things resolving which is slower than anyone expects it to be while it is happening and seems faster in retrospect. Crane was held in the Copper Ridge jail while the paperwork traveled from Frank's office to the county seat and back again, acquiring the additional signatures and stamps that converted a local arrest into a formal charge. The charges, when formally filed, were substantial: coordinated fraud involving a minor, financial coercion, the arrangement of armed intimidation. The county magistrate added a fourth charge when the financial records were examined more closely, which revealed that Crane's dealings in Colorado were part of a larger pattern that the territorial authorities had been monitoring without sufficient evidence to act on until now. He lost his mineral rights petition with the county, which was automatic once fraud was established. He lost his business license in Colorado territory within 30 days of the formal filing. The financial investigation that opened in Denver following the arrest reached two other projects in other territories and produced additional proceedings that Crane would be occupied with for years. Wade Ellis was held separately, which was Frank's way of preventing the two men from coordinating a story before their respective interviews with the county investigator. Ellis's situation was simpler in its facts and more complicated in its human dimensions. He had coerced his daughter into signing documents under duress. He had accepted money to facilitate a fraudulent scheme involving her inherited property. He had traveled across state lines to attempt to enforce those fraudulent documents after learning they were being challenged. The county investigator wrote a thorough report. The territorial court would determine what followed. The four men who had blocked the road or charged with making armed threats against civilians in the presence of a law officer and held pending formal proceedings. Frank later arranged for reduced charges in exchange for detailed information about Crane's network of hired arrangements throughout the territory, which produced additional evidence that the authorities had been building toward for years. It was, Frank considered, a reasonable outcome from an unreasonable afternoon. The mineral rights to the land south of Copper Ridge were formally confirmed as belonging to Nora Ellis, the legitimate sole heir of the Ellen Whitmore estate, by the county land office 11 days after the hearing. Frank brought the paper out to the ranch himself and set it on the kitchen table and had a cup of coffee while she read it 3 times the way she read all documents now, from the beginning to the end, in full light, without anyone standing over her shoulder telling her what it said. "What you do with it is your business," Frank said. "There are people who will want to talk to you about development options. You do not have to talk to any of them before you are ready." "I know," she said, "and when you are ready, you have choices. That is the point of the document." "I know that too," she said. She set the paper on the table and looked at it. "I am not ready yet, but this is the first time in my life that not being ready has not been someone else's problem. It is just a thing I am still deciding." Frank finished his coffee and put on his hat and said goodbye to all 4 of them and rode back down to Copper Ridge. That same week, Reed came in from the East Field after the noon meal and set a cloth sack on the kitchen table without announcement. Inside were 6 apple saplings, roots wrapped in wet burlap, purchased from the nursery in Copper Ridge. He did not explain the purchase. Nora looked at the saplings and then at Reed, and then out the east window at the ridge that blocked the northwest wind. She picked up the sack. Reed picked up the other saplings he had left on the porch. They went out to the east field together and did not come back until the last one was in the ground. Boone watched from the barn doorway. He did not say anything about the apple trees. He went back into the barn and worked on the things that needed working on. And at supper that evening, nobody mentioned it, which was the right way to handle a thing that had been 3 weeks in the making and did not need a ceremony. She went to see her father once. She went alone. Boone offered to ride with her, and she thanked him and declined. She took the copper-colored mare who had decided by now that she was someone worth carrying and rode the 12 miles to Copper Ridge at the middle of a September afternoon when the light came down at the long angle of a season beginning to turn. The holding cell in Frank's office was in the back, separated from the front room by a solid door. Frank left her alone with the door between them and went to the front porch. She sat in the chair on the free side of the bars and looked at her father. He looked smaller than she remembered him being. This was a common observation that people made about those who had held power over them, and she understood it intellectually, but understanding it intellectually had not prepared her for the specific reality of sitting here and seeing it as a physical fact. He was 52 years old, and he looked it in a way that he had not looked it before, as if the scaffolding that had held the appearance together had been quietly removed. "I am not here to give you anything," she said. "Not forgiveness, not anger. I am not carrying either one in for you." He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent his life doing neither enough honest work nor enough rest, and showed both. "Your mother loved that land," he said. She had not expected him to say that. She sat with it for a moment. "I know," she said. "She told me about the light on the river in the mornings, when she was a girl." He nodded, a small movement, without any of the practiced weight he usually gave his nods. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am going to see it, the land. I am going to go there and see what she meant about the light." She looked at him steadily. "Not because of you, not in spite of you, just because it is mine, and I have not seen it yet, and I am ready to." He did not say anything to that. She had not expected him to. She stood up. She did not extend her hand. She did not lean toward the bars. She stood straight in the way she had learned to stand and looked at the man who had required her to learn it and made the decision that she had been building toward for a long time. "I will not carry what you did to me as a debt you owe me," she said. "That is not generosity. That is just what I have decided to do with the weight of it, because carrying it as a debt only keeps it attached to you, and I am finished being attached to you." She picked up her gloves from the chair. "The court will do what courts do. That is separate from me." She walked to the door and knocked twice for Frank. She did not look back. She rode out to the land on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the hearing, when the aspens along the upper elevation had already begun their annual turn, and the air had the cold clarity that September brings to Colorado as a preview of what is coming. She followed the river, rode south from town to the property boundary, which was marked by a stone corner post that her grandfather had set in the ground in 1855 and that had not moved in 24 years. She tied the mare to a scrub oak at the boundary and walked in on foot. The land was what abandoned land looks like after 2 decades of being unattended. The fences that had existed were down in most places. The foundation stones of the original structure were still there, half buried in the grass and the creeping brush that had taken back the cleared ground. One apple tree had survived, gone wild and unpruned, producing small hard fruit that nothing but the deer had been eating for years. She walked to the river edge and stood where the bank was highest and looked at the water. The light on it was exactly what her mother had described. In the long morning angle of a September sun, the river's surface caught the light and held it and gave it back in a form that was somehow better than what had gone, in the way certain materials do with certain kinds of energy. It moved. It was constant in its movement, and constant in its light, and it had been here every morning for as long as there had been mornings, regardless of who owned the ground above it, or what they did with it, or whether anyone stood on this bank to see it. Her mother had stood here. She stood here now. The mare stamped once on the ground behind her and settled. A hawk moved across the sky above the ridge to the east. The river went on doing what it had always done. She stood there for a lengthy time. When she walked back to the mare and mounted and turned north toward the ranch, she carried something that she had not brought with her on the ride out. My resolution, not the specific emotion that conclusions are supposed to produce in stories. Something quieter and more durable than either of those. The simple fact of having been in a place and seen what was there to see without anyone deciding for her whether she should be there or what it should mean to her when she arrived. 6 weeks after the hearing on an afternoon in early October, when the aspens along the high ridge line had turned their full gold and the first cold of the coming season had begun to make itself known in the mornings, Nora stood on the small rise east of the Hargrove barn, where the property opened up enough to show the full sweep of the valley. From here she could see the ranch below, the barn with the good roof pitch, the fence lines she had walked and the fence posts she had helped reset, the kitchen window that caught the morning light on the eastern face, the creek line at the edge of the property, and beyond that the valley floor, and at the far end of it the buildings of Copper Ridge, small with distance and clear of eye in the high country air. To the east side of the property, 6 small trees stood in their new ground, with their roots taking hold in the soil that the ridge protected from the northwest wind. Further south, following the river, she could not see from here, but knew the location of by memory now was the land. She stood on the rise and let the afternoon light fall across her and thought about nothing in particular, which was a state she had spent years unable to access and was only now learning to inhabit without suspicion. The clock inside her, the one that had been running since she was old enough to know what it was counting, moved to the hour. The hour that had once meant footsteps. The hour that had once meant the door. The hour she had marked in wood and kept in writing and carried across 3 states in the careful grip of a woman who understood that some things must be documented to be believed and some must be believed to be survived. She noticed her hands. They were still, both of them, resting at her sides in the afternoon light with no effort required to keep them there, no act of will holding them against the shaking that the hour used to produce automatically the way cold produces, shivering without consultation. The hour passed. She was standing on a hill in Colorado in October, with the wind off the mountains moving through the grass around her and the valley laid out below, and the land her mother had loved visible in the general direction of south, if not in specific sight. There was nothing to count. There were no marks to make. There was no door. Below the rise in the kitchen of the ranch house, the lamp was on in the window. She could smell the wood smoke from the stove on the wind. Somewhere in the direction of the barn, she could hear Reed saying something to one of the horses, his voice carrying, without the words, which was the way Reed's voice always carried when he was talking to something that did not talk back. She breathed in the cold, clear air of the mountain evening. She turned and walked back down the slope toward the house.